Mattia Merlini. Mattia Merlini is a PhD fellow at the University of Milan, holding a Master of Arts in Musicology from the University of Milan and a second Master of Arts in Philosophy from the University of Pisa. His current research interests concern various aspects of ludomusicology, video game music studies, and especially eclecticism in so-called VGM. The title of his presentation is Downplaying Eclecticism, Traumatic Transnational Adaptation in Japanese Video Game Music.
Thank you. Thank you for having me, and thanks to the organizer especially for their hospitality and for putting this together. And now I'll start with my paper. As part of my ongoing doctoral research, I'm studying different ways in which stylistic features, especially in terms of instrumentations and what Philip Tagg would call style flags, are included in video games in an eclectic way. When coming to Japanese productions, what has always struck my attention, both as a scholar and a gamer, is a degree of eclecticism one can often hear, and especially a specific kind of eclecticism that I have defined, stateless vertical eclecticism. The term eclecticism, from eclectikos, which means choosing the best, has been used for a long time in a derogatory way to denote the tendency of composers to patch together what already exists in lack of original ideas. With the advent of postmodernism, however, the value of the concept has radically changed, even in the sphere of art music. In popular music, it never really had a negative connotation. I prefer this term over other ones that are related to it, like polystylism, hybridism, and syncretism, not only because these have usually specific nuances that are not very pertinent to my object of interest, but also because eclecticism seem to employ a sort of spontaneity in the act of mixing distant stylistic features, as opposed to more systematic and deliberate acts of grafting for compositional research and experimentation. Such a kind of eclecticism can often be heard in Japanese music, for anime and video games in the first place. And I have interpreted this phenomenon in light of the concept of mukokuseki, intended as a melting pot of elements that, once intertwined, constitute a new ground zero for neutrality. I read this phenomenon in continuity with a long process of confrontation of Japan with the musical West, culminating with the US post-war occupation and the arrival of a huge amount of previously unheard music, to which Japanese people and composers were, willingly or not, heavily exposed. From a time of hybridization between Western and Japanese music, things gradually shifted towards a postmodern and globalized Japan, where the traditional element was pretty much put aside, but the idea of mixing things together remained there, strong and steady, a sort of second-level marker of Japaneseness, so to say. But what happens to this kind of eclecticism when it is taken westward? The ludomusicologist William Gibbons has studied the effects of video game localization on music and highlighted how cultural markers are sometimes removed or changed in order to address the specific needs of target demographics. He has proposed 3 recurrent trajectories of localization from Japan to the Western market. While basic localization implies few or no musical changes at all, it may even permit an emphasization of cultural markers, as in the case of Katamari Damacy. Complex localization and blending can lead to what I call traumatic adaptations. Soundtracks here were the scars of a more intrusive localization process to different degrees. In complex localization, we can witness an internationalization like that described in Gibbons's case study on Tales of Symphonia, which saw an anime-like opening song being replaced by an orchestral anthem in the Western versions of the game. In blending, the soundtrack can even be completely replaced, as in the case of Gran Turismo 2, where the original rockish soundtrack was replaced with pre-existing popular music in Western editions. In this paper, I expand this kind of analysis by presenting 3 more case studies of traumatic adaptations where eclecticism is the main victim. More specifically, I emphasize how these changes are not only and perhaps not even mainly motivated by cultural reasons, but often by commercial reasons involving synergies between music business, film and video game industry. Let me start with the case of Kuroi, namely the theme song from Drakengard 3, Dragoon 3 in Japan, recorded both in a Japanese and international version. The studio behind this track is called Monaka and is formed by a collective of composers, including Keiichi Okabe and Keigo Hoashi, who are the main names behind the soundtracks for the now well-known Nier franchise, by the same director of Drakengard franchise. The last 20 years, the studio has scored hundreds of video games and anime, but also some live-action and animated feature films. Kuroi is the result of a collaboration between Monaka and the J-pop singer Air Aoi. But in the international edition of the game, this version has been replaced with a very similar one with vocals by the longtime collaborator Amy Evans. In the international version, the arrangement differs subtly, but very meaningfully when it comes to eclecticism. Let me play you a little snippet. Would it be possible to hear it through the system? Because otherwise the next snippets where details are important will likely not be understandable from, and I don't know if people at home were able to hear it. Okay. Okay. Okay, we can try the other one, like here. Okay, let's try it. It's better. Okay. So, main differences here can be found in, first, the beat. It is much more punchy, so to say, in the Japanese version, with a timbre that would not sound out of place in a dance song. While in the international version, the pattern is a bit different, with a brighter timbre and quick passages that bring it closer to sounding like an orchestral percussions. Let's see if we can hear them. Yeah, you can't really tell the difference with this audio, but yeah, the timbre is quite different. And the second main difference is the guitars. Acoustic guitar strumming is lower in the mix of the international version than it is in the Japanese one. But most evidently, the electric guitar's chords, providing the Japanese version with an additional rockish flavor, are completely absent from the international version. Let's try with this. Electric guitar is absent from the international. So one could immediately think that the Air Aoi version had that Air Aoi had been hired to sing a sort of promotional version for the Japanese market of an in-game track sung by Amy Evans. But not only it is bizarre that the supposedly discographic version is longer than the international one because of an extended piano intro, but also that the language remains Japanese in both versions. Moreover, a tweet by Amy Evans seems to suggest that Air Aoi's version was the original one, and this possibly gains further credibility when we compare this case study with earlier similar cases involving the Drakengard franchise. Indeed, Hitori, Drakengard's 2 main theme by Ryoki Matsumoto and Satomi, and vocals by Mika Nakashima, had already been replaced with a rearranged song from the first Drakengard in the international version of the game. What the two songs have in common is that they were both distributed by Sony Music. So perhaps some copyright issues prevented the creators of Drakengard 3 from including Air Aoi's Kuroi in international release of the game. But since this time the music had been composed by Keiichi Okabe, they probably still had the opportunity to keep the song and only change the vocalist with the familiar Amy Evans. But then why changing the arrangement too? I can see several concurrent reasons here. Kuroi is like one of those J-pop songs featuring a famous singer and used for an anime opening. It takes part in a cross-promotional strategy involving different cultural industries and is especially appealing for a Japanese audience. The international version is more strictly linked with the in-game experience, and its arrangement reflects different contexts and functions, and maybe also the expectations of Western ears. But I do not think this is the main reason behind the change. We can only guess, but perhaps were it not for the supposed copyright issues, we would be able to hear Air Aoi's vocals and those beats and electric guitars too in the West as well. After all, the other theme song of the game, This Silence of Mine, sung by Chihiro Onitsuka, is present in both editions, and all electric guitars are in place. My second case study is still connected with industrial logics and budgetary reasons, but is perhaps more clearly contaminated with cultural reasons behind the changes. And speaking of the music for Crimson Dragon, originally written by Saori Kobayashi and then rearranged and integrated by Jeremy Guerin overseas. Kobayashi was known for her previous work with Crimson Dragon's director on the Panzer Dragoon franchise, which featured music in her peculiar ethtronic style, mixing electronic music with so-called ethnic elements. Apparently, this style was not opulent enough to satisfy the Hollywoodian hunger of Microsoft when Crimson Dragon became an Xbox One exclusive game. So, the soundtrack was taken overseas and transformed into something else by American professionals that worked to fulfill her musical vision by basically burying it under massive sounding strings and choirs. Here we can hear a little comparison.
My effort I kind of viewed as working to fulfill her vision, her musical vision. In a lot of cases we were adding choir, bigger strings, bigger elements to kind of expand the size and scope of the score.
最初のうちは割とこうすごく飛んでて気持ちいいっていうイメージから始まっていたのでだんだん今回のゲームになるに至ってやっぱりちょっと非常に、戦いらしくっていうことにちょっとなんとなく途中から少し変わってきた感もあるので。
So, I'm not here to decide whether or not it was a good idea to add, expand, and make everything bigger in such a soundtrack, but what is certain is that eclecticism is way less evident in the American reworked versions. Kobayashi, who openly speaks of an Hollywoodization of the soundtrack, seems not too critical of it, at least officially, but regrets the fact that people were not able to hear her original versions in the end. It is probably wearing this regret in her heart that she decided to include a couple of songs from the original versions in the album Journey by her band Akane. This allows us to have a clear idea of how much the soundtrack has changed in the process. Maybe I'll skip this sample because it's close to what we just heard. My question is that here we are facing a case of what I've called hypertrophic orchestra. After it became possible for video games to stream recorded music directly from a game disc, the gap between video game and film music was virtually erased, and those who could afford it often started to employ real-life orchestras in their games. Sometimes to be able to compete with the Hollywoodian blockbuster model and thus gain cultural legitimization, orchestral sections became so pervasive that even when eclectic elements were present, they could barely be heard, buried as they were under thicker and thicker layers of symphonism. This is even more true as of today, to the point that the Japanese composer Hisayoshi Ogura has mentioned the existence of an orchestra sickness, so to say, haunting Japan and perhaps the entire video game industry. And Crimson Dragon's eclecticism is one of the victims of this homogenizing tendency. As the budget became bigger, it became possible to challenge film music in terms of grandiosity, and Microsoft seized the chance to upgrade the music by downplaying its eclecticism. So the last case study will take us back in the 90s, when music still had to be synthesized on board by home consoles, but was already realistic enough to allow us to recognize precise synthetic emulations of real-life instruments. Sword Maniac is a Japanese video game from Super Nintendo, acquired and localized by Activision for the Western distribution. Here we are dealing with a much more radical change. Not only one single track, nor arrangements only, but the replacement of a whole soundtrack with, quote, hot techno soundtrack, written the way we can read in the photo, by the electronic music band Psychosonic, as advertised on the game box, which also showcases the change of title from Sword Maniac to X-Kaliber 2097. Needless to say, while the original soundtrack by Hitoshi Sakimoto and Hayato Matsuo blended together pseudo-symphonic elements and electronic sounds, the new soundtrack was straightforward techno-sounding and therefore lost its eclecticism. The first, of course, was from the original, and the second was from the American version. To understand this specific case better, we can look at the Activision's localization habits from those same years. Indeed, another Japanese game, Biometal, had been localized in the same way in 1993, just 1 year before X-Kaliber 2097. This time, the music by the Eurodance duo 2 Unlimited had been designated to replace the original soundtrack. And since the new music was a pre-existing one, someone had to convert it from the recorded discographic version to a sequenced version that could be used for onboard synthesis. The man behind this procedure was Eli Lexa, a quite mysterious figure who took care of the adaptation of the soundtracks from both games. I picture him out like a 90s rave enthusiast in charge of giving these Japanese cyberpunkish games a sort of modern subcultural touch, but I'm probably just fantasizing. Let's hear just a couple of samples. This is the sequenced version, and now we are going to hear the original version. Okay. Although Psychosonic were kind of an obscure choice when compared to 2 Unlimited, a couple of their singles had sold well by then, and it is clear that Activision relied heavily on the commercial potential of having Psychosonic's music featured in their video game. Not only the new music was advertised on the cartridge box, as we just said, as we already seen, but you could also find their name written in the game backgrounds here and there. Probably the band benefited from this as well, and perhaps it is not by chance that Psychosonic continued to have their music featured in video games, and after they disbanded, their member, Michael Larson, even became an audio director at Epic Games, which is one of today's leading forces in the industry. Again, music was likely changed not because the original soundtrack was deemed not fit for the job, but because of commercial interests and of opportunities. And then, when the change came in, it worked towards non-eclectic choices. And this is where commercial motivations leave the stage for more culture-led practices. So these case studies have shown that when traumatic adaptations happen in the localization process of video games, cultural factors constitute only a part of the equation, probably one that on many occasions is not even the most important one, nor the one that triggers the transformation in the first place. Synergies and conflicts between the cultural industries involved in the process of localization should then be kept at the core of our understanding of such processes, which are often driven by the opportunity or the impossibility of doing something that looks commercially promising for the game. However, the constant victim of these processes is vertical stateless eclecticism, thus configured again as a cultural marker that is not often found in Western music as it is in the Japanese one. Once you are changing the music for the Western market, it is unlikely that you will do so without keeping an eye to the Western expectation, which revolve much more around genre consistency than around mixing stylistic features. While it is debatable whether eclecticism gets removed on purpose or just because of different spontaneous attitudes of the involved agents, the trajectory that takes Japanese video game music to the West does not look like a very safe road for such a precious feature of much Japanese music. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Mattia, for your wonderful presentation. There are any question from the audience?
I have a very basic question about the terminology that you use, where you use the word traumatic, and I was wondering if you could explain a little bit, because that's a very heavy word in English. I don't know if that's a theory that comes from that's native English or if it's come from another language, but it strikes me as very it's very visceral. So I was wondering if you could explain a little bit about that.
I agree that it's kind of visceral in Italian as well, which is the original language in which I wrote things that are related with this research. I use it because I conceive this term like something that, when trauma is involved, I think that you can easily see the scars of something that is working from within and has a manifestation on the outside. And I think it kind of describes what happens here. There is something moving on the inside that provokes some kind of scars that are visible from the outside, and we can try to work to understand what has caused these changes in the first place, and why the results are configured the way we are able to witness them from the outside. So that was pretty much the idea. I don't know if I answered the question.
Thank you. That was really interesting, and I really liked your very detailed picking apart of the layers and the changes. I just thought, not a musicologist myself, and I found that just really interesting, so I appreciate that.
Thank you.
And this is a really basic question, but have you looked at the opposite movement as well of imports to Japan, and if they do something similar to the soundtrack or other types of localization that happen the other way around?
Okay, yes, this is something that I want to do, and I have started to do. The problem is, the thing is that it is a bit rarer, because it is very common to see this kind of trajectory where Japanese video games are localized in the West. I have the impression that the other way around, it's a bit different, because especially when you go back to the classic video games, most of them come from Japan. So it's kind of easy to find them, at least from the second half of the 80s to the first year of the new millennium. All those games come from Japan, and so there is a lot of possible case studies. The other way around, it is not so common, and I don't think that, as far as I've seen until now, I've not found really traumatic experiences and events during these processes, but I have found some situations where some very powerful franchises that maybe come from cinema or other industries and are Western based franchises maybe not localized, but used by Japanese production to, for instance, produce a game. There are some, for instance, Disney branded games that are made in Japan, or that are come from collaborations between Western developers and Japanese developers. And I think that is an interesting ground for doing such a kind of research, because it's not really the same thing, but you can see how, for instance, some Disney songs are rearranged in a production that involves Japanese composers and these kind of things. And I plan to do at least that, but still have not delved much deeper than that in the issue.
If you then consider the different ways or the different localization strategies, right, depending on where stuff comes from. And could you talk about this a little bit more in context with the concept of mukokuseki that you used? I would find that really interesting.
So you mean...
So when I'm sorry, I'm really jet lagged. I've got to say that. I came from Japan 2 days ago. I think it's 2 o'clock in the morning for me, so sorry. But I think what I'm trying to get at, I find the concept of mukokuseki complicated anyway, in many, many ways. And I'm thinking, so if something comes from Japan, leaves Japan and goes to the West, or if something comes from the West and go to Japan, if we want to apply that concept of mukokuseki, are those two different application cases? So does it differ how we apply mukokuseki to that? I don't know if I make sense. It's 2 o'clock in the morning.
No, I think I understood your question. The thing is that I'm using mukokuseki concept to refer to the kind of eclecticism I'm interested in. So it has not really much to do with what you just said, I think, which has more to do with from where certain things come and how you mix them. while my eclecticism, the kind of eclecticism I'm doing research on, is more like second degree of neutrality that is obtained by mixing things together until you kind of lose the original flavor of it. And basically putting everything together means ends up being like neutrality in a way. This is the way I'm kind of using Mukokuseki as opposed to the Takokuseki, where maybe I could also use the words, although I know that they are not really the same, but a melting pot and salad bowl, those kind of concepts. And I'm interested in those situations where the nation, that's why I'm calling it stateless vertical eclecticism, where there is not the will to employ foreign elements to refer to a specific ethnicity or nationality or whatever, but is used in a neutral way, so to say, like a color that you have at your disposal and you can use to make your music for their, I don't know, maybe for the timbral characteristic and so on. So I know this doesn't answer to your question, but I don't know how to answer because this is not the way I am using the concept of Mikokuseki, which I agree, by the way, is kind of complicated. And I have also read some kind of very, I wouldn't say contradicting things and accounts of this concept, but almost like several accounts that are not entirely harmonized in a way. So I still need to understand if it is a right concept to do what I'm trying to do, but that was the idea.
Yes, thank you very much for your presentation. If I understood you correctly, you still consider eclecticism to function as a cultural marker for Japaneseness. And I would agree that eclecticism plays a crucial role, especially in the popular music from the 1990s on in Japanese popular music. But there is also a lot of eclecticism in Western popular musics during that time. So I wonder if this eclecticism actually is perceived by the Western audience for whom the soundtrack is replaced. Or how do you know that it is perceived as a cultural marker for Japaneseness?
This is really a huge question, and I'm trying to really sum up now, but maybe we'll have occasion later to delve deeper. But yes, I think that eclecticism is a sort of cultural marker, but maybe in the past it was a specific kind of eclecticism putting together traditional Japanese elements and Western elements, while I think that now it's more like the concept of putting together things don't have to be Japanese and Western, but rock, electronic, funk, whatever. It's the very concept of mixing that is a cultural marker, I think, with very nonchalant attitude to mixing. And of course there is something similar in the West as well, and I think is related with globalization, postmodernism, that has a lot to do with Japan as well as with the West. And in film music especially, there are some trends that relate interestingly with the repertoire I'm interested in. The thing is that I think that still Western eclecticism often sounds a bit different from the Japanese one. And what I'm trying to do, I'm not over yet with that, but I'm working on it, is trying to focus on some archetypical kinds of eclecticism that may be more popular in the West as opposed to Japan. For instance, I have the impression that some specific timbral mixtures are more common in Japan and not very easily heard in the West, while others are very common in the West, like the electronic beat in film music or something like that, and maybe not so much in Japanese production. So I'm trying to figure out if there are some patterns that distinguish the two worlds, so to say. about the thing about perception. I don't really know how it is perceived, but I think that we as Westerners are a bit, at least a bit, used to eclecticism nowadays because of these tendencies, and so we may not, or many of us won't perceive the Japanese eclecticism as something very distant from our culture. But I think that that specific flavor of Japanese eclecticism could still be seen as kind peculiar and perceived as something Japanese, or at least different from our way of doing eclectic things by Westerners. And yes, I think the time is over, so I won't go on with this. But if you want, I would have something more to add about this. But I'm working on this kind of topic as well, to try to make some confrontations and stuff like that between West and Japan and eclecticism, these kind of things.
Thank you very much, Mattia, again.